Hi everyone! We're excited to share our report where we dive into Linda Tuhiwai Smith's incredible masterpiece, Decolonizing Methodologies, Research, and Indigenous Peoples. So let's get started. As Smith defines it, decolonization is a critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values that inform research practices. From the perspective of an indigenous and colonized Maori woman like herself, Decolonizing Methodologies, Research, and Indigenous Peoples offers a thorough review of Western paradigms of knowledge and research, which, as the main problem, she believes that research and indigenous people cannot be told in the same breath. Westernized research methodologies, knowledge, and ideas result in imperialism for indigenous people. Her objective is to challenge research traditions that perpetuate narratives that marginalize indigenous groups. Smith urges research methods that are authentically derived from local knowledge, customs, and standpoints. If not, a non-indigenous researcher would ultimately distort or misrepresent the facts of what only an indigenous researcher who is better positioned would be able to capture and tell the truth more accurately. What is imperialism? It is the extending of power and dominion, particularly through direct territorial acquisition or by obtaining political and economic control of other regions. Christopher Columbus lingers in the imperial literature. He may be a hero adventurer for many. He is a figure of disgust and is repulsed by in the indigenous literature. So there are 4 different ways of describing the form of European imperialism. Number 1, imperialism as economic expansion. Number 2, as the subjugation of others. Number 3, as an idea or spirit with many forms of realization. And number 4, as a discursive field of knowledge. Instead of being mutually exclusive, these uses should be viewed as an analysis to concentrate on the various facets of imperialism. A number of events that led to Europe's economic growth were first described by historians using these terms. Furthermore, besides colonizers interrupting research initiatives with indigenous people by, if not explicitly, discreetly incorporating their imperial and colonial rhetoric into discourses that aren't about them. The broader aspect, imperialism, colonialism did not just rob them of their lands and resources, they manipulated how indigenous people are viewed by others and how indigenous people view themselves, endangering their inherent organic identities expected to be preserved and passed on, self-determination, and recognition as fully human.
Let's now move on to, is history important for indigenous people? The answer seems obvious. Yes, history matters. But the real issue is whose history and how it is told. Western history, shaped by Enlightenment and imperial thought, often erase or dismiss indigenous account as irrelevant. Oral traditions, genealogies, and even names were reclassified as myths rather than true accounts of histories. Smith outlines how Western history is built on assumptions that it is totalizing, universal, chronological about progress, and told as one coherent narrative. It claims to be objective, but in reality, it is tied to power, deciding who counts as human, who makes history, and who is left out. This leads to what Smith calls contested histories. Indigenous people have always held alternative accounts of the past, like the stored in oral traditions, landscape, carvings, etc. And under colonialism, these stories clash with the colonizers' version in courts, in schools, and even the media. These contests are not just about facts, but about power, whose version of history is recognized as truth. Reclaiming history then is central to decolonization. And holding alternative history means holding alternative knowledge, which can guide new ways of living and resisting. Therefore, revisiting history is an unfinished business, a way to seek justice and recenter indigenous perspective. Is writing important for indigenous people? Writing has always been a double-edged sword. It has been used to misrepresent indigenous peoples. Books in academic texts often say, "We don't exist," or portrays us in negative and distorted ways. Patricia Grace even called books dangerous because they erase or misrepresent indigenous identity. But writing is also a powerful tool of resistance. Leonie P. Hama reminds us that representation matters. IP struggle to have their voices heard and their own image validated. Writing back allows communities to reclaim their stories, shift the center away from the West, and speak to other colonized peoples. Ngugi wa Thiong'o takes this further, arguing that language itself carries culture. Writing in indigenous languages becomes an act of anti-imperialist struggle, while writing only in colonial language risks alienation from one's own history and culture. Finally, writing theory also matters. Indigenous scholars are now developing their own framework to explain contemporary realities. As Katie Irwin says, real power lies with those who design the tools. Theory gives space to strategize, resist, and recenter indigenous perspective. So writing is not neutral, it can be dangerous, but it is also important. It is a both side of struggle and a means of survival, resistance, and renewal for indigenous people.
It is argued that Western civilization are from the experience of non-Western, especially the Black, and just refine itself into what counts as West, which allows the West to maintain their dominance as they appropriate and refine the so-called Western ideas as the truth. Now let's move forward to the cultural archive, which highlights how the non-Western ideas transformed to West. For Foucault, Western ideas are not generally from the West, but instead they are fragments of many colonized culture. This storehouse allows the invisible rule of practice to classify what counts as valid and invalid knowledge, what can be said and who can speak. It is not visible inside the system, but still the West benefit from it because they preserve their dominance and power through it, as certain stories or research counts as real and valid if it fits their dominant power structure. On the contrary, even though the West doesn't recognize these invisible rules, it is visible to the indigenous people as they have been the subject of these exploitative rules. For Hall, on the other hand, West maintains dominance even though it transforms to new ideas because of the classification and representation they create for both themselves and for the other. The West is not a mere place geographically that helps determine what counts as real, which enables the West to retrieve and reform this to different contexts, which will benefit the West to maintain their dominance with real material consequence for the colonized people. Example here is how West see themselves as rational and civilized by contrasting itself with the other. Nandi also discusses the forms of colonization. No matter what the colonizer's intention, all forms of colonization share the same struggle, same consequence, which led the colonized to have something in common, the same language, same knowledge, and even the same struggle for decolonization, because the westernized culture has been embedded within them. So in this chapter, it highlights how research is important in decolonization of indigenous people, but the problem lies in its methodologies, since mostly research are based on positivist view, wherein researcher believes that research should focus more on empirical data, but at the same time, it exploits the indigenous people, as research contributes to the classification, representation, and evaluation that benefits the West. Moving forward, as mentioned earlier, the archive is drawn from multiple knowledge, culture, even the ones taken from the colonized people. The archive defines what's the truth for the classification of West to non-West, which creates a sense of superiority. Now, let's focus on how Project of Modernity contributes to this superiority. Project of Modernity marks the end of feudalism and absolutist authority and announced the beginning of the modern state. Alongside with modernity is the expansion of European imperialism. These classifications are judged based on the Western standard of civilization and rationality that assigns racial values and ranks individuals based on how nearly human, almost human, or subhuman they are by judging them in terms of how educable of Western standard they seem to be. This whole system of discovery opens the opportunity for research to study the colonized through the lens of what counts as West. Research is becoming a tool for power and dominance because it is an instrument that legitimizes the various colonial practices. East and West, drawn in 1493 by Papal Bull, is a division referred to flexible positional superiority by CE. West creates representation that controls not only the indigenous lands but also their identities, control the indigenous people by defining them and considered it as a universal truth. With this control over knowledge and education, the West was able to gain authority superiority on indigenous people, making colonialism a tool for both intellectual and political dominance. Overall, the West was able to uphold their superiority by defining, classifying, and representing both West and the non-West according to their own standards. Through new discoveries and research, the West remained relevant because what is considered truth are usually connected to their ideals, but at the same time, this research reveals the exploitation of indigenous people. They are materialized to perceive and distinguish what is West from non-West. And that's all for my part. We will now move forward to the next presenter, Ms. Garcia.
As I continue the discussion, we'll dive into my part that highlights how indigenous communities reclaim the power to define and create knowledge. Basically, how research becomes a tool for empowerment rather than oppression. So in this chapter, Linda Smith starts by presenting what she calls the Indigenous Peoples Project. Here, she wants to change how we view the research. It shouldn't be purely Western or colonial, but something that actually serves Indigenous empowerment. In this chapter, she explains that for so long, research has been used to define and control Indigenous identities. Now, the goal is to reverse that and to let Indigenous people take back control of how knowledge about them is created. Now, this chapter has two subtopics, which are the social movement of Indigenous people and an agenda for Indigenous research. First, Linda connects her ideas to the global Indigenous movement of the late 20th century, where groups like Maori, First Nations, and Native Americans united against colonization. These movements were not only political, but only cultural and challenging to the idea that only Western knowledge is valid. Through education and collaboration, Indigenous people reclaimed research as a tool of sovereignty. So then, for the next subtopic, Linda Smith then outlines what Indigenous research should be, guided by respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. It must come from community priorities, not outsiders. Instead of imitating Western methods, it focuses on healing, identity, language, and preservation. Its research gives back, not extracts. Linda Smith also shows how this agenda can actually be practiced. She talks about community-based and tribal research and the need to train Indigenous scholars so that they can lead their own studies. This approach makes sure that research truly reflects lived experience and contributes to long-term development. So, in a nutshell, articulating an Indigenous research agenda means claiming the right to define and own knowledge. Research becomes not just an academic act, but also a political and cultural declaration that stands with, we are the authors of our own stories. To end my part, Linda Smith wants to remind us that decolonizing research is not just about rejecting Western systems, but it's about reimagining research as an act of justice of what belongs to us. It's the transformation of knowledge into something that heals.
So, this is the continuation for the section Is Writing Important for Indigenous People, which here I will going to tackle about a case study of Maori. But before all of that, there is a movement created on what Smith describes as favorable conditions for research involving Maori. As for generations, Maori were treated as objects of study, and these are, first, the Waitangi Tribunal of 1975 is where to address historical breaches of the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi between Maori and the Crown. Second, the Te Kuhangareo of 1982, where the Maori language revitalization movement built on the idea that reclaiming language is reclaiming culture and identity. And lastly, critical openings in academia. Feminist, Marxist, and post-positivist scholars were questioning the supposed objectivity of science and the authority of researchers, where Maori scholars could step in and redefine what counted as valid research. They believe that the research extends knowledge. But the question is, but whose knowledge? Historically, colonial research extracted data from indigenous communities only to enrich universities and reputations of outsiders. And because of that, the communities themselves were left poorer. It can be spiritually, materially, and linguistically poor. But then, Smith flips that question where research should not only extend knowledge, but also extend the people by empowering them, serve them, and heal them. Because for Maori, knowledge isn't an abstract object to be possessed. It's a living practice bound to ancestry and language. And that is why that the research must be accountable not to institutions, but for the Maori's people stories and their lives it touches. So unfortunately, Smith takes pains to avoid making the Maori situation seem like a completed success story because until now, Maori people are still fighting for their rights for their land, wherein she refers to it as a transition rather than a finished. There are still conflicting views on research, and colonial practices are still present in financing system, even for universities and among those indigenous academics. Like, they might even question about who gets to frame the research, what values guides it, and who benefits from its results, because they still believe that majority of the researcher holds authority and the community is an object of study, not the origin of knowledge. So one thing for sure, Smith wants that reclaim not just land and language, but the very means of knowing, so that indigenous peoples are no longer written about, but write themselves into the world on their own terms. After all, the process of decolonizing research is still ongoing and necessarily self-reflective. Now, we should move on to the next part.
Now that we have seen the ways Western system dehumanize indigenous communities through their research methodologies and how the social movement of indigenous people became a powerful instrument in reclaiming their identity by setting a new agenda, let's dig deeper towards the development of their research methodology, the Kaupapa Maori research. By answering this question, what happens to research when the research becomes the researcher? Several professionals characterize the method of Kaupapa Maori research. According to Kathy Irwin, it is culturally safe and involves the mentorship of elders. This implies the difference of it to other forms of research because here, acknowledging cultural aspects, values, customs, and traditions of Maori people are the goal without any limitations. Also, Russell Bishop stated that it addresses issues made by cultural superiority that spread in every social institution. Then, Graham Smith emphasized it as being related to being Maori and their philosophy, grants the validity of Maori knowledge, language, and culture, and is concerned with the root problem about struggle in Maori's identity. Related here is the concept of wanao referring to family, but it goes beyond the immediate family and reaches to community. This is their core unit in creating social harmony and welfare by keeping Maori values central to the project. And in terms of research, wanao became the way of organizing research groups, serving as the foundation for uniting communities and expressing voices. Such decision-making and participation happens around the concept. Last but not the least, the methodology aims to present Maori people as individuals and a community. It actualizes through networking and wanao research groups, then requires community consultation before doing the research. So its development also proceeded in the participation of young Maori researchers. As for the conclusion, the main problem states that Western research methodologies and researchers dehumanize the identity, culture, and nation of indigenous people through the way of European imperialism. Because of this, Tuihai Smith's objective is to decolonize Western methodologies and reclaim the reputation of indigenous people and the whole community by promoting the ability of Maori people as researchers rather than being researched. Kaupapa Maori research as methodology provided space for Maori knowledge and voices across disciplines such as in education, health, law, politics, and many more. From this, the activity of research is transformed. That's all for our presentation. Thank you for listening.